Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a pretty fascinating look, I think, at the origins and the initial ideas behind the Great Reset.
Okay.
This is something that's been in the news a lot, and you shared with me some really compelling material on it.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a really interesting story here about how this initiative actually came together.
Yeah.
And for folks listening today, I think our mission with this deep dive is to really get to the heart of that context.
Right.
What were the sort of key drivers behind it? Who were the early proponents of this idea?
Yeah.
And what were those sort of like fundamental ideas they were putting forward right from the beginning?
Okay.
And my hope is that by doing this, it'll give you a much clearer lens for understanding all the different conversations and viewpoints that have emerged, since this whole thing kind of took off.
Right.
And just to give you a quick sense of what we're working with here, we're basing this deep dive on some excerpts that really outline the launch and the foundational ideas behind the World Economic Forum's Great Reset initiative.
Okay.
Now, you probably encountered the term before.
Definitely.
But today we're really going beyond, the headlines and the sound bites to explore its roots and the thinking behind it.
Right.
So where does this whole story actually begin?
Well, it's fascinating because while the Great Reset, as a phrase, really gained traction around mid-2020, the underlying ideas and the kind of push for this sort of systemic change actually have a much longer history.
Okay.
So the documents you provided, they really point to this formal announcement on June 3rd, 2020,
Okay.
as the sort of unveiling of the Great Reset as this initiative from the World Economic Forum.
Got it.
Or WEF, as they often call it.
Okay, June 2020, so right in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Exactly.
That timing feels really significant.
It's absolutely pivotal. The material really highlights that this announcement, which also declared the Great Reset as the central theme for the WEF's 2021 summit.
Right.
It involves some very prominent figures.
Yeah.
Notably, WEF founder Klaus Schwab
Okay.
and Britain's Prince Charles. They were key voices in this initial rollout.
Prince Charles's involvement. I mean, that's pretty notable.
Yeah.
What do you think his role or the significance of him participating was at that early stage?
Yeah, so his involvement, particularly his longstanding advocacy for sustainability and for, a different model of economic development,
Right.
it really lent, I think, significant weight and visibility to the initiative from the outset.
Yeah.
It kind of signaled that this wasn't just a purely economic proposal, but that it had these broader societal and environmental dimensions.
I see.
So the
Yeah.
when and the who are pretty clear.
Yeah.
But let's dig into the why a little bit. What was the sort of fundamental argument that the WEF was making at this time? What was the core problem they believed the Great Reset was the answer to?
Yeah, so the WEF's central argument, as they laid it out, was that the sheer magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic's impact, the widespread disruption that it caused globally, it created this undeniable and urgent need for some kind of fundamental change.
Yeah.
They were contending that this crisis demanded a comprehensive revamping of almost every aspect of our societies and our economies.
Comprehensive is the right word there.
Yeah.
The source material, it touches on everything from the way our education systems are structured to the very nature of our social contracts, the sort of implicit understandings that hold societies together, to even the fundamental conditions of how we work.
Right.
Their ambition, as they articulated it, it was nothing less than a great reset of capitalism itself.
Wow.
A transformation they believed needed to involve every country and every industry worldwide.
So a full-on rethink, not just some minor adjustments here and there. And Klaus Schwab himself, he had some pretty strong statements, I think, about the urgency and the opportunity presented by this moment, right?
They certainly did.
Yeah.
The excerpt directly quotes him as saying that the pandemic offered a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world with this explicit goal of moving towards a future that would be both healthier and more equitable.
Yeah.
That phrase, narrow window, it really underscores this sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And this idea that this was this unique moment that needed to be seized.
Okay, so the pandemic is obviously the immediate trigger for this launch in 2020.
Yeah.
But let's delve a little deeper into that.
Okay.
What specific aspects of the pandemic, led them to believe that this reset was so crucial and so timely?
Well, the material emphasizes that by the spring of 2020, the extensive global economic shutdowns, They had starkly revealed these existing fragilities within our systems. It wasn't solely about the immediate public health crisis, but the resulting economic fallout, things like escalating debt levels, widespread unemployment, and increasing disparities in wealth.
Yeah, we all remember those initial economic shock waves. That uncertainty.
Yeah. And the WEF's proposed solution was this concept of building back better.
Right.
However, their vision went beyond simply recovering to the pre-pandemic status quo.
Right.
They advocated for this fundamental redesign of our underlying economic and social systems, guided by what they considered to be, new, more sustainable principles.
So the aim wasn't just to kind of repair the damage that was done, but to essentially create a new operating system for the global economy and for society.
Exactly. And there's another quote from Schwab that really reinforces this. There are many reasons to pursue a great reset, he stated, but the most urgent is COVID-19.
Okay.
Characterizing it as one of the most severe crises in recent history. He also warned that failing to address the pandemic and these concurrent crises, like climate change and inequality, would lead to a world that was even less sustainable, less equitable, and significantly more vulnerable than before.
That paints a pretty stark picture of the potential consequences of inaction.
It does.
So the key takeaway here is that the WEF viewed the pandemic not just as a crisis to overcome, and then return to normal.
Right.
They saw it as this critical turning point, this emergency that should be leveraged to push for what they termed a total reset.
That's a very accurate distillation of their initial position.
Yeah.
This idea of a simple return to normal was explicitly deemed insufficient and even undesirable in their early framing.
Okay, so 2020 and the pandemic were the immediate catalyst.
Right.
But the material also suggests that the Great Reset wasn't this totally novel idea that appeared out of nowhere.
Right.
It hints at some deeper historical roots.
It does.
Where do we see those connections?
This is where it gets really interesting and provides some crucial context. As you pointed out, the Great Reset wasn't a sudden invention of 2020.
Yeah.
Klaus Schwab and the WEF, they have a long history of advocating for what they term stakeholder capitalism.
Nope.
And for you to understand the key shift here, that's moving away from this idea that a company's only duty is to its shareholders making money, to a broader responsibility encompassing employees, the environment, and society as a whole, and for greater global cooperation to tackle these shared challenges.
Okay.
The text actually traces the intellectual groundwork for the Great Reset back to a WF initiative from over a decade prior, following the 2008 financial crisis.
The 2008 financial crisis, another huge global upheaval.
Exactly.
That undoubtedly prompted a lot of rethinking.
For sure.
What emerged from that earlier WEF effort?
Well, that initiative was known as the Global Redesign Initiative.
Okay.
And it culminated in this substantial 600-page report.
Wow.
That essentially proposed a reimagining of global governance structures. A central tenet of that report was a push towards what they called multi-stakeholder governance.
Multi-stakeholder governance.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What does that practically entail?
So the source explains it as a system where national governments wouldn't be the sole or ultimate authorities in decision-making on a global scale.
Okay.
Instead, they would be positioned as one voice among several,
right,
alongside other influential entities,
yeah,
such as large corporations and civil society organizations.
So a real redistribution of influence and decision-making power on a global level.
It is indeed.
That's a pretty significant departure from the traditional intergovernmental model.
It is, and the source even quotes a scholar describing this 2008-09 WEF plan as potentially the most comprehensive proposal for redesigning global governance since the formulation of the United Nations during World War II.
Wow.
So this wasn't a small-scale proposal.
Yeah.
It reflects this significant ambition for systemic change.
Right.
And here's a crucial insight, I think, for your listeners.
Yeah.
The Great Reset, launched in 2020, it directly builds upon this foundational concept.
Okay.
It's essentially the WEF applying its vision for a top-down redesign of both capitalism and global governance to the specific context and opportunities presented by this post-COVID world.
So we see this earlier push for a different kind of global governance.
Right.
Now, fast forward to 2020.
Yeah.
With the pandemic is this major global disruption.
Yeah.
How did those earlier ideas directly feed into the Great Reset that was announced?
Well, the pandemic provided not only the urgency, but also, in their view, the opportunity to implement these longer-held ideas on a wider scale and with greater public awareness of these systemic vulnerabilities.
It sounds like the groundwork for fundamentally changing global governance had been laid over a decade earlier.
Exactly.
Which is a crucial insight into the scale of their ambition.
It is.
Now, the material also delves into some of the evolving ideological landscape that helped pave the way for the Great Reset. We've touched on stakeholder capitalism,
right.
And then there's this really, I think, thought-provoking, and for some, quite concerning phrase, you'll own nothing, and you'll be happy.
Right.
How does that fit into this broader picture?
Yeah, so as we've discussed, Klaus Schwab had been a long-standing advocate for this transition from a shareholder-centric model of capitalism to a more inclusive stakeholder model.
Right.
This principle that businesses have responsibilities that extend beyond merely maximizing profits for their shareholders was a core element of the WEF's philosophy.
Okay.
The source points out that even in January 2020, just before the pandemic really took hold globally, the WEF's Davos Manifesto explicitly centered on the importance of stakeholder capitalism.
So the intellectual foundation was being established even before the immediate crisis hit.
Exactly. And this broader vision of how society and the economy should function also led to some more radical thought experiments within the WEF's network, such as the you'll own nothing prediction, which aimed to explore the potential future implications of this shift. That particular phrase originated from the WEF's Global Future Councils, a kind of foresight and think tank group.
Got it.
Which in 2016 released a set of 8 predictions for 2030.
Right.
The prediction, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, definitely generated the most discussion and significant controversy.
Well, I can see why it paints a very specific and, for a lot of people, quite unsettling picture of the future.
Yeah.
What was the underlying thinking behind that prediction?
Right.
What did that envisioned 2030 scenario actually look like?
So the scenario imagined a future where a young professional living in a city might not own traditional assets like a house, a car, or even clothing.
Wow.
Instead, access to everything would be through services rented or borrowed on demand. The underlying premise was that these services would be seamlessly provided and digitally tracked. And that this shift would ultimately lead to solutions for major challenges like pollution and traffic congestion, theoretically enhancing overall quality of life.
So the theoretical benefits are around greater efficiency and sustainability.
Yeah.
But the trade-off is this really fundamental change in our relationship with ownership.
Precisely. And it's really important to understand the original context of that specific quote. The WEF actually presented it as a summary of an essay written by a Danish member of parliament named Ida Auken. In her essay, she described a potential future where, in her words, I don't own anything, no car, no house, no clothes.
Wow.
Everything she imagined has become a service.
Okay, so it wasn't necessarily the WEF explicitly advocating for this complete absence of personal ownership,
right,
but rather highlighting a potential future scenario that someone else had envisioned.
Exactly.
However, the way it was presented in their materials definitely sparked a lot of speculation and concern.
Absolutely. Auken herself has since clarified that she was exploring a possible future for better and for worse,
right,
and not necessarily promoting it as this utopian ideal. However, the WF's decision to feature this concept so prominently, understandably, triggered significant alarm for many.
Yeah.
The idea of a world without personal property, it touches upon these very fundamental aspects of our economic systems and individual lives, impacting not just ownership, but also considerations around privacy and individual autonomy.
Right. It's easy to see why that particular prediction became such a lightning rod.
For sure.
And why it's so important, I think, in understanding the potential trajectory of thinking among those involved in shaping the Great Reset.
Absolutely.
This notion of a really profound transformation of our economic lives and our relationship with possessions.
It offers this glimpse into a mindset that envisions a fundamentally different relationship between individuals and the economy.
Yeah.
One where access potentially trumps ownership.
Okay, so by the time the pandemic struck in 2020, you have this long-term advocacy for stakeholder capitalism.
Right.
Over a decade of work on rethinking global governance. And even these more radical visions of a future with dramatically different models of ownership circulating within the WEF's network.
Yeah.
So when the Great Reset was formally announced, what was the overarching narrative being presented? What were the central goals they articulated?
So the source material makes it clear that by 2020, Schwab and his allies had this well-defined grand narrative ready.
Yeah.
The existing system was fundamentally flawed,
Okay.
and the pandemic presented this unique,
Right.
albeit disruptive, opportunity to completely reset it.
Okay.
At the launch event, Schwab himself stated that every country, from major powers to smaller nations, would need to participate.
Wow.
And that every single industry would have to undergo transformation as this integral part of this great reset.
That's an incredibly ambitious vision to articulate.
It is.
What were the primary objectives of this transformation, according to the WEF's initial statements?
The stated primary goal was to jointly and urgently build the foundations of our economic and social system for a more fair, sustainable, and resilient future.
Okay.
WEF materials at the time specifically called for the establishment of a new social contract centered on human dignity, social justice, and where societal progress does not fall behind economic development.
So there was this clear emphasis on integrating, broader social and ethical considerations.
Right.
Alongside traditional economic growth metrics.
Precisely a deliberate move away from solely focusing on economic indicators and towards a more holistic understanding of societal well-being and progress.
And the reset was also explicitly positioned as this direct response to some of the major crises that were either exposed or intensified by the pandemic, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that the Great Reset was presented as this direct answer to these widening wealth disparities.
Right.
The deep-seated racial and social inequities that were so starkly highlighted. Rising levels of unemployment, increasing burdens of debt, and of course the ongoing and critical threat of the climate and environmental crisis.
So a comprehensive, multifaceted approach designed to tackle this whole range of interconnected global challenges.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the WEF articulating this interconnectedness. The text even quotes UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres welcoming the Great Reset as a wake-up call and stressing this urgent need to build more equal, inclusive, and sustainable economies and societies that are more resilient in the face of pandemics, climate change, and other global challenges. This indicates that the WEF's framing resonated with other significant global leaders and organizations who also recognized a pressing need for systemic change.
So to bring it all together, the Great Reset was presented as this comprehensive solution to this multitude of intertwined global crises, using that sense of urgency created by the pandemic as this window of opportunity to fundamentally build back better than the perceived unsustainable status quo.
That's a very clear and accurate summary. It was positioned as this integrated vision for a more resilient and equitable future on a global scale.
Okay, well, this has been a really illuminating, I think, exploration into the origins and initial ideas behind the Great Reset. We've traced its journey from the formal announcement during the pandemic back to earlier WAF initiatives and even some of those more thought-provoking concepts that helped shape the underlying thinking. So for you listening, you should now have a much more solid understanding, I think, of the initial motivations and some of those key concepts that were central to this initiative right from its inception.
Indeed, you can see how the pandemic served as this significant catalyst, but also how the Great Reset drew upon years of prior thinking and advocacy related to global governance and the fundamental nature of capitalism.
So as a final point for you to consider, given the WAF's strong emphasis on this concept of multi-stakeholder governance, where national governments are just one voice among many, and this intriguing idea of potentially owning nothing in the future. What potential benefits and what significant challenges do you see arising from such a fundamental shift in how our societies and economies are structured, and even in our fundamental relationship with the concept of ownership itself?
It's a big question.
It is. This deep dive is really just the beginning. And there are certainly many more layers and perspectives to continue exploring on this really important and complex topic.
For sure.
So until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.